Chapter 12 An Age of Reform, 1820 to 1840, Parts 3 and 4. Part 3 Black and White Abolitionism. Blacks played a leading role in the abolitionist movement. Northern blacks, attracted to Garrison's opposition to colonization and his demand for equal rights, were half of the Liberator's subscribers. Several blacks were leaders of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and northern-born blacks and fugitive slaves such as Frederick Douglass quickly became major organizers and speakers. Many fugitive slaves published accounts of their experience of slavery, which became powerful tools in communicating the reality of slavery to northern audiences. Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel published by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852, was based on one fugitive slave's life and sold more than 1 million copies in only a few years. Even though abolitionism was the first racially integrated social movement in American history and the first to make equal rights for blacks central to its agenda, the movement could not avoid the racism prevalent in white America. White abolitionists could not entirely free themselves of racial prejudice. They monopolized key decision-making positions and resources in the movement. By the 1840s, black abolitionists, frustrated with white control, started to hold their own black abolitionist conventions. Some, like Henry Highland Garnet, departed from the white movement by calling for violent resistance to slavery. Nevertheless, white and black abolitionists did mount legal and political campaigns against racial discrimination in northern states, and they had a few victories, including ending school segregation in Massachusetts. Black abolitionists, in particular, challenged whites to recognize blacks as equal citizens and fellow human beings, and they undermined intellectual and cultural arguments for white supremacy. Black abolitionists rejected America's claim to be a land of freedom, and many free blacks dramatically reversed the common association of the United States with the progress of liberty. Black communities, barred from celebrating Independence Day in many northern communities, instead celebrated January 1st, the day the foreign slave trade was abolished, or August 1st, the anniversary of West Indian emancipation. Blacks openly praised Great Britain as a nation of freedom, contrasting it with America as a land of tyranny. More than white counterparts, black abolitionists forged an ideal of colorblind citizenship. They also argued that black poverty was caused by slavery and that freedom had an economic dimension as well. The greatest speech on American slavery and American freedom was delivered by Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York in 1852. Speaking after Independence Day festivities, Douglass asked, "What, to the slave, is the 4th of July?" He answered that the 4th of July celebrations showed the hypocrisy of a nation proclaiming its commitment to liberty and yet daily committing practices more shocking and bloody than any other nation. But Douglass also claimed the Revolution's legacy and its rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence. Douglass suggested that America could restore its original mission to spread freedom only when it abolished slavery and freed the great doctrines of the Declaration of Independence from the narrow bounds of race. Abolitionism initially sparked violent hostility from Northerners, who thought the movement threatened to dissolve the Union, interfere with profits originating in slave labor, and overthrow white supremacy. Led by gentlemen of property and standing, usually merchants with economic ties to the South, mobs disrupted abolitionist meetings, destroyed abolitionists' printing presses, and assaulted abolitionist activities. William Lloyd Garrison was nearly lynched by one Boston mob. In 1837, anti-slavery editor Elijah Lovejoy was killed by a mob in Illinois while defending the printing press for his newspaper from assault for the fifth and final time. Andrew Jackson's Attorney General allowed abolitionist literature to be removed from the mails. In 1836, when abolitionists flooded the House of Representatives with petitions calling for emancipation in Washington, D.C., the House adopted the gag rule, which prohibited the body from considering the petitions. The rule was repealed in 1844, in great part due to the efforts of former President John Quincy Adams. By then, attacks on the free speech of abolitionists convinced many Northerners that slavery was incompatible with the democratic liberties of white Americans. Abolitionists broadened their appeal in order to win the support of Northerners who cared little for black rights, but could be persuaded that slavery threatened their own freedoms. The struggle to discuss slavery and its abolition in public made abolitionism the first great struggle for free speech in American history. Much of abolitionism's strength was founded in Northern women, who joined it in large numbers. Most were evangelical Protestants, New England Congregationalists, or Quakers, who thought that slavery violated Christian belief and practice. The public sphere was open to women in ways that government and party politics were not. They could not vote, but they could circulate petitions, attend meetings, march in parades, and speak in public. Women were active in the temperance movement, building asylums, and other reform campaigns. Women were also critical in campaigns to redeem prostitutes from sin and protect the morality of single women, and they attacked the sexual double standard by identifying men who frequented prostitutes or abused women. Chapter 12, Part 4, The Origins of Feminism. Women's participation in abolitionism inspired the early movement for women's rights. In fighting for the rights of slaves, women gained a new understanding of their own subordination in society and law. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, converted to Quakerism and abolitionism while visiting Philadelphia and began to denounce slavery in public. They had been preceded by Franny Wright, a Scottish-born follower of Robert Owen, who spoke on communitarianism, slavery, and labor reform in the late 1820s and early 1830s. The Grimke sisters used controversy over their speeches to denounce the idea that it was unfeminine for women to engage in public activity. Male criticism led them to advocate the necessity for sexual equality in all spheres of life. The Grimke sisters were the first to apply the abolitionist doctrine of universal freedom and equality to women's status. Their work and writings helped inspire other women to adopt the standard of women's rights in the early 1840s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, who became key organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the Women's Rights Convention of 1848, were anti-slavery activists. They had been barred from abolitionist meetings because of their sex. The Seneca Falls Convention raised the issue of women's suffrage for the first time in American history. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, added women to Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal, and listed the injuries men had inflicted on women, including denying them the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention further denounced an entire social structure that denied women access to education, employment, property and wages, and children in the event of divorce, deprived women of independent legal status when they married, and restricted them to the home. Many middle-class women criticized restrictions that made it impossible for them to gain an education, enter a profession, or otherwise develop and use their talents. Early feminists argued that women deserved the range of choices that made up the essence of freedom. Women, they argued, should be allowed the same opportunities to fully develop themselves as men enjoyed. Women also insisted on the right to participate in the market revolution. Although women at Seneca Falls were mostly middle class, attendees rejected the notion that the home was the women's sphere. Early feminists challenged this idea in a number of ways. Some wore a new style of dress made of loose-fitting tunics and trousers called bloomers, intended to liberate women from their extremely restrictive dresses and corsets that so confined them as to make it impossible for them to engage in much physical activity. While feminism, by calling for rights equal to men, in one sense demanded an expansion of freedom rather than its redefinition, in another sense, feminism challenged prevailing notions of women's innate difference, that women were naturally dependent and irrational, that the world was divided into public and private spheres, and that issues of justice and fairness did not apply to family relations. Feminists used slavery to coin a concept, the slavery of sex, which critiqued all aspects of women's subordination to male authority. While Mary Wollstonecraft had long ago made an analogy between marriage and slavery, this analogy was spread by abolitionism. Southern defenders of slavery often linked slavery and marriage as natural forms of inequality. Of course, while slavery and marriage were technically different, married women, until the passage of women's property and wage laws around the time of the Civil War, could not own their own property or retain their own wages, which instead accrued to their husbands. Inspired by abolitionism, women's rights advocates turned the popular understanding of self-ownership or control over one's person in a new direction. The abolitionists' emphasis on the slave master's violation of the slave woman's body lent a new reality to the ideal of self-ownership for women's rights activists. The law of domestic relations assumed a husband's right of sexual access to his wife and his right to inflict corporal punishment on her. Courts generally did not interfere in cases of physical or sexual abuse unless it was extreme. The issue of women's private freedom showed underlying differences in the women's rights movement. A belief in equality between the sexes and notions of natural differences between men and women coexisted in the movement. Even as some feminists entered the public sphere and challenged aspects of the cult of domesticity, they accepted other dimensions of women's subordination. Even staunch feminists like Susan B. Anthony avoided discussion of women's sexual freedoms in and out of marriage. Yet, the gradual decline in birth rates over the course of the 19th century indicates that many women exercised more freedoms in their intimate lives. Even in reform circles, the issue of women's rights was very controversial. Abolitionist men who welcomed women's participation typically did not welcome their advocacy of rights for themselves. Disagreement over women's proper role in the abolitionist activity sparked a split in abolitionist ranks in 1840. The appointment of a female abolitionist to the business committee of the American Anti-Slavery Society caused male abolitionists who believed women should not occupy such a prominent position to form their own rival organization, the American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society. Behind the split was a fear among some abolitionists that Garrison's radicalism on issues like women's rights and his refusal to endorse voting or running candidates for office was stunting the movement's growth. To make abolitionism a political movement, these men formed the Liberty Party, whose candidate for president in 1840 received only 1/3 of 1% of the total vote. By 1840, the abolitionist movement had accomplished its most important work. It had spread the message of anti-slavery throughout the North and awakened a broad array of people and groups to the evils of slavery and the necessity of its abolition. The movement's greatest achievement was ending the conspiracy of silence that attempted to maintain national unity by suppressing public debate on slavery.